Hello, everyone. This is 17.1, the Cold War and Vietnam. So, this is going to be the Vietnam era, mainly in Chapter 17. We're going to start with a quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was one of the first believers in what is called the domino theory of communism. We'll get to that in a minute. And he said basically, you have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is that it will go over very quickly. So let's start with John F. Kennedy and his Cold War operations. So Kennedy came into the White House at a time when the Cold War was very hot, on the verge of becoming nuclear. Instead of calling for huge retaliations whenever the USSR did anything, Kennedy believed in more of what we call flexible response, where the size of our going after the Russians was based upon the size of what they did. It was proportional, it was fair, it was reasonable. He also called for more peaceful methods of spreading democracy, the idea that, we can show the rest of the world what good people America is the goodness of America through things like the Peace Corps, where volunteers would go to places in need around the world. He also set up the Alliance for Progress, which was trying to get us trading and also trying to help sort of developing countries in Latin America during this time. So here's Kennedy meeting the Peace Corps volunteers. My dad is not in this picture, but he was in the Peace Corps. Now let's look at Kennedy responding to communism in Cuba. We did have to be pretty old school Cold War hard line against the Cubans, though, during this time. So in 1959, Fidel Castro had a communist revolution that took over the island country of Cuba. Cuba is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, so this made America very nervous that suddenly we've got a communist country knocking on our back door, basically. Many Cubans actually fled to the United States, and one of the plans that we had was we can train them up, these Cuban refugees, send them back to Cuba, attack Cuba, and have them take over Cuba. This was sort of our plan at the time. Here's Fidel Castro, by the way, who said, "A revolution is not a trail of roses. A revolution is a fight to the death between the future and the past." Now, under Eisenhower, the CIA had been planning this idea of invading Cuba, using Cuban American soldiers to get rid of Castro. However, it didn't actually come to be until Kennedy was president, and it turned out to be absolutely a disaster from top to bottom. The Cubans knew that we were coming. They knew this was happening so much that some people thought it was actually, some of the Cubans said this has to be like misinformation or disinformation. However, these Cuban Americans went and attacked at a place called the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and most of them were either killed or captured. And Kennedy actually had to go on TV and take full responsibility. This was a huge defeat for America in the Cold War. So here are some of the survivors of the Bay of Pigs being arrested. They were later freed after we paid a couple $1 million worth of food and medical supplies to Cuba for their release. So after the Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro pressured Nikita Khrushchev, who's the head of the USSR after Stalin died, to put nuclear missiles into Cuba. And the USSR did precisely that. They put in nuclear missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and the missiles were photographed by American spy planes. So it looked like Russia was sneak attacking us or planning a sneak attack. It looked like they were about to start an offensive nuclear war against the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which was about 13 days worth of backdoor negotiations and lots of worried sort of back and forth between the U.S. and the USSR, eventually ended with a settlement where they would take their missiles out of Cuba, we would take our missiles out of Turkey, and we promised never to invade Cuba. So here's Nikita Khrushchev meeting with John F. Kennedy. He once said, "Politicians are the same all over. They promise to build a bridge even where there is no water." Here are some of Kennedy and his advisors during the Cuban Missile Crisis. A lot of his army advisors were, advising that he should just blow up Cuba and Russia, go with the nuclear option right away. Kennedy went with the more roundabout option, making deals and also blockading Cuba with a bunch of American Navy ships in order to stop them from just going in and taking over. But we were very close to nuclear war. By the time this was over, we were hours away. And one of the things we did in order to avoid this sort of thing was make it easier for the president and the head of the USSR to talk to each other. So we put in what is called the hotline, a direct line from the Oval Office to the Kremlin, so that these two world leaders could talk without having to wait 12 hours for a translation. In 1963, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, America, Great Britain, and the USSR all signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to stop testing our above-ground nuclear weapons, because that was turning into an environmental and radiation disaster as well. So here's the red phone. You just pick it up, and immediately you are talking to the Kremlin. Now, let's look at the Berlin crisis at this time, too. Khrushchev wanted all of Berlin to be communist. He was tired of East Germans sort of fleeing into West Berlin. And so Kennedy refused to budge, and so Khrushchev decided to put up a wall instead. Khrushchev ordered the building of the Berlin Wall. It went around all of West Berlin and stayed up until the late 80s, early 90s, after the fall of communism. So there was a legit straight-up wall surrounded by no man's land, surrounded by machine guns, that if you tried to cross from East Berlin into West Berlin, you were going to get shot. So here's a piece of the Berlin Wall that is still up. Now, let's also look at the reasons that the U.S. got involved in Asia during this time. So this is post-Korea. Vietnam had been under French control for decades by this point. However, they were very tired. The Vietnamese were very tired of the French having control over what they called French Indochina back at the time. The revolutionaries were led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh, and Ho Chi Minh was trying to gain their independence. America, however, was supporting the French, and we were almost paying for the French to stay in power. We worried that if Vietnam became independent, they would become communist in the 1950s. And like we saw with that quote, America believed in what was called the domino theory at this point, that if we let one country fall to communism, all the rest of them are going to go as well. So here, by the way, is Ho Chi Minh, who said, "You will kill 10 of us, we will kill one of you, but in the end, you will tire of it first." And that is exactly what happened with both the French and the Americans in Vietnam. In the end, France got out of Vietnam, and Vietnam became two countries due to the peace treaty. We got North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam is communist. South Vietnam is, I don't know, I wouldn't say democratic. Capitalist might be a better word for it. They had a dictator. Now, here are North and South Vietnam. And let's look at the response to communism in Vietnam. In response to what was going on in China and in North Vietnam, America and 7 other countries formed sort of another NATO. It's a NATO for Southeast Asia called SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Again, stop the spread of communism. That's the goal. And in 1957, the Viet Cong, which is North Vietnamese communist soldiers, invaded South Vietnam, and the South only survived thanks to support from the United States. Kennedy took a more active role. He sent troops to Vietnam as advisors, which was a nice way of saying soldiers. The leader of South Vietnam eventually was removed with U.S. support because we didn't like him very much. He was a dictator. He was giving us a bad name, basically. And while Johnson was president, we saw that North Vietnamese boats actually attacked American ships in what is called the Gulf of Tonkin. After this happened, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that said that the president has the full power to send troops into Vietnam. And boy, did we ever send troops into Vietnam. This was the start of the Vietnam War. And so here are some North Vietnamese ships attacking the USS Maddox.